At the UFC 300 post-fight press conference, Dana White announced the long-awaited, oft-rumoured matchup between Michael Chandler and Conor McGregor at UFC 303 on June 29, 2024 in Las Vegas, Nevada. 3 years removed from his devastating leg injury while fighting Dustin Poirier in their trilogy bout in the summer of 2021, it looked like the biggest draw in UFC history would finally be making his long-awaited return. However, while writing the script for this video, it was announced that Conor would miss the event due to a toe injury. While a rematch has not officially been announced, it is rumoured to be rescheduled for UFC 306 at the Sphere in Las Vegas on September 14th of this year. As for Chandler, should this fight actually materialise in the fall, it will be his first fight in 2 years since his loss to the very same man against whom Conor suffered his leg break. Conor has unfortunately become the poster child for fighter inactivity even prior to his leg break. Whether this is due to out-of-the-cage controversies and substance abuse, or issues with the UFC brass being unwilling to book him in fights more regularly and holding him in contractual limbo, is anybody's guess. And at this point, it doesn't really matter. Since his return to the octagon in 2018, after his boxing detour in the global spectacle that was the Maymac Worldwide Press Tour and subsequent boxing match against Floyd Mayweather, more on which later, Conor lost 3 of 4 bouts over the span of almost 3 years, culminating in the aforementioned leg break. If we include his most recent sabbatical, which is, in fairness, due to the injury and potentially to some backstage shenanigans via Dana White and the UFC, Conor hasn't picked up a win since January of 2020. Conversely, since joining the UFC in 2021, ironically on the same card where McGregor fought Poirier for the second time back in January of that year, Michael Chandler has fought 5 times, 3 times in 2021 and twice in 2022. Chandler has become one of the UFC's golden boys, taking on all comers and putting on chaotic slugfests at the expense of his own health, record and legacy. Not to mention at the expense of his natural athleticism and Division 1 wrestling background, both of which could have been utilised to game plan more viable roads to victory in pretty much every one of his UFC losses. The reason for Chandler's layoff is much more straightforward. Conor. After coaching opposite each other on the 31st season of The Ultimate Fighter, there was a preliminary fight announcement between the two. No date, no location, just a gentleman's agreement that the two would face each other in the near future. For Chandler, this made all the sense in the world. At only a few years shy of 40, a fight against the biggest star in the sport would guarantee him the biggest payday of his career, adding an extra layer of financial security come retirement, which most fighters sadly never attain. Meanwhile, a win over Conor on the biggest stage would add immeasurably to his legacy, putting him up there with Poirier, Nate Diaz and Khabib Nurmagomedov, all of whom were launched into superstardom after beating McGregor. So now, a year after the two shook hands in the octagon and agreed to fight, and after a metric ton of mind games from Conor, threatening to overlook Chandler in favour of other competition, the two will hopefully face each other in what will be certainly one of the biggest events in UFC history. So much has already been said about Conor McGregor's background, so I don't want to go into too much detail about it here. Rather, I'd like to focus the first third of this video on Conor McGregor's initial rise through the UFC. So I'll keep this part brief. Conor McGregor was born on the 14th of July 1988 in Dublin, Ireland. He was raised in Crumlin, a working class suburb on the south side of the city. Much has been made about how tough Crumlin is, and yes, it does have its fair share of antisocial behaviour and crime. Crumlin grew to notoriety in the 2000s due to the Crumlin-Drimna feud, a gang war between local criminals in Crumlin and the neighbouring suburb of Drimna over drug territory. By the way, for my American followers, a suburb doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in Irish vernacular as it does in American vernacular. In Dublin, suburb means its literal definition, suburban, an area outside of the city. So imagine more Compton than Beverly Hills. However, in spite of its issues, Crumlin is far from being the worst part of the city, and 2 of my best mates actually grew up there. Even still, there are more idyllic places to grow up, and I'm sure he ran into his fair share of challenges, as well as some discrimination based on his postal code and his accent. At the age of 12, Conor began training at the Crumlin Boxing Club under the tutelage of Pete Sutcliffe, whom he still trains with to this day. In 2006, at the age of 18, McGregor moved with his family to Lucan, a much more peaceful suburb in northern Dublin. It was here that Conor met future UFC fighter Tom Egan, who introduced Conor to the sport of mixed martial arts, and it quickly became an obsession. Providing the same outlet and viability for self-defense as boxing, MMA also introduced Conor to the art of kicking, grappling, and submissions. McGregor became enamoured not just with all these various techniques, but with human movement in general, something which we'll touch on later. In 2007, he took his first and only amateur fight, earning a swift and decisive first-round technical knockout. Less than a year later, he would take his first professional fight, this time earning a second-round stoppage. It was clear, McGregor had found his calling in life. However, it would be another few years before he'd realise his full potential. Around the same time as his pro debut, his parents urged Conor to find a more realistic career path, in case fighting didn't work out. He was now an adult and still living under their roof, so, reluctantly, he took up an apprenticeship as a plumber, which he hated. Quote, "I hated every minute of it. You were talking 14 or 15 hour days. I was getting ordered around, getting people their lunch, all this crap. I just thought, this life isn't for me. I'm going to pack it in. I'm going to chase my dreams." 18 months into his apprenticeship, Conor quit and decided to pursue MMA full time. Now, it should be noted that in spite of him being on the dole and struggling during the early parts of his career, McGregor did have both the support and food and board from his parents, something which not everyone is fortunate enough to have. Even still, and taking full advantage of the situation, he dedicated himself fully to pursuing MMA. From 2008 to 2011, McGregor racked up a professional record of 9 wins and 2 losses, with both losses coming by the way of submission, including one against short-lived UFC fighter Joseph Duffy, the only method of defeat he would suffer for the first 13 years of his career. In February of 2011, McGregor made his debut for Cage Warriors, Europe's biggest MMA promotion. Conor would fight an astonishing 5 times in 2011 alone, all of which, bar one, ended in a first-round knockout or TKO due to punches. The other one ended in a second-round TKO. In 2012, he scaled his activity back slightly, fighting 3 times, which is still more than respectable. However, these fights were of much higher significance. In July of 2012, he defeated David Hill to claim the vacant Cage Warriors Featherweight Championship. He did so by submission due to a rear naked choke. It's sweetly ironic that McGregor claimed his first championship by submission, given that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would be his Achilles heel during his career, at least up until that point. It also showed his rapidly growing fan base that he was evolving as a fighter, beyond that of just a man with dynamite in his hands. On New Year's Eve, just before the dawn of 2013, McGregor knocked out Ivan Buchinger in the first round to claim the vacant Cage Warriors lightweight title, becoming the first man in the company's history to hold 2 titles simultaneously, while also solidifying himself as the biggest star the promotion had ever seen. He would never fight for Cage Warriors again. Part 1. Rise to Stardom. On the 6th of April 2013, McGregor made his UFC debut on UFC on Fuel TV on the preliminary card against Marcus Brimage. Brimage was a journeyman fighter who was nonetheless on a 3-fight win streak in the promotion. So while hardly world-class competition, he was still holding his own in the biggest MMA promotion in the world by the time he matched up against McGregor. McGregor was riding a sizable wave of hype as the eve of his UFC debut dawned, but even still, little was known about the Irish fighter outside of the dedicated European MMA fanbase and hardcore fans further afield. While researching this video, I had the pleasure of rewatching all of Conor's UFC fights, naturally starting with this one. Needless to say, McGregor demolished Brimage, TKOing him in just over a minute. Not only was this a dominant performance, but it also showed the wider audience some of McGregor's trademark techniques and personality. His use of reach and distance, with his wide taekwondo/karate stance, his use of hand fighting to gauge distance, his use of teeps to the body as a way of not only gauging distance, much like a jab, but also to wind his opponent, and to open them up for headshots, and his unorthodox use of punches. In the 70 plus seconds of action, Conor threw maybe 3 jabs total. However, I do recall him throwing 5 rear left uppercuts from his southpaw stance with no setup. That's absolutely insane when you think about it. When Muhammad Ali fought George Foreman, he peppered him with straight rights with no setup. It was considered an insult to throw a backhand without first setting it up with a jab, and Ali banked, fortuitously so, that Foreman would never have trained for that. Here was Conor, 100 pounds lighter than a heavyweight, in 4-ounce gloves, throwing rear uppercuts. And not from the clinch either, but from the outside, the final of which dropped Brimage, which led to the ground and pound that stopped the fight. The final 2 elements are footwork and counter-striking, which works symbiotically for Conor. Utilising his wide stance, Conor is able to dart in and out, which is advantageous both offensively and defensively. Defensively, it means he can dodge Marcus's attacks by jumping back out of the way, while offensively, he can immediately dart back in to land shots of his own. What's amazing about this fight is that Conor really doesn't use his arms to block or parry shots, rather relying on his feet and head movement to evade punches. He does eat one good shot while attempting to weave, but that's about it, all the while with his hands down low. This is fundamentally terrible for MMA, and any coach would be insane to instruct their students to do this. But when you're as naturally gifted as Conor is, and have the height and reach advantage he had over Brimage, you can get away with it, and it makes for an almost impossible riddle to solve. This is where the counter-striking comes into effect. Where Brimage is standing in a conventional MMA stance, legs slightly wide, high guard, throwing 1s and 2s, Conor is easily able not only to evade these attacks, but to counter with his more unconventional strikes. Rear uppercuts, long looping hooks, and straight counters down the middle. This was also the wider world's first taste of the second key factor in the McGregor mystique, his personality. There was the infamous Dana 60 G's baby post-fight interview quote, referring to the 60 grand knockout of the night bonuses the UFC were still giving out back in 2013, and at the post-fight press conference, where he joked about going back to Ireland and telling the social welfare to F off. Even though it was early days yet, McGregor's exciting fighting style and charisma were charming and mystifying MMA fans, pundits, and journalists in equal measure. However, this was only the beginning. His next fight that same year came against a young Max Holloway. Holloway had a 2-inch height and 4-inch reach advantage, meaning McGregor was no longer fighting a smaller man and had to adjust his game plan accordingly. Before he threw a single punch, Conor hit Holloway with 8 kicks, teeps to the body and thighs for distant measurement and attack prevention, and roundhouse kicks to the head, 2 conventional, 2 jumping. Once the 2 settled in, Conor started throwing more conventional combinations, which he used not just to do damage, but to close distance more effectively, blinding Holloway with flurries of lefts and rights, while mixing it up with some of those single punches from awkward angles he used against Brimage when appropriate. The biggest thing in this fight was fluidity and efficiency of movement. Throughout the early stages of his career, Conor talked about the importance of movement, balance, and body control, and would even go as far as to look to how animals, such as gorillas, moved for inspiration. The gorilla tattoo on his chest was influenced by the logo of his gym, Straight Blast Gym, but is emblematic of this inspiration also. And this emphasis on movement and control can be seen here. How he throws those left roundhouse kicks with no tell and what seems like no effort whatsoever, the fluidity of his combinations, how he mixes in those unorthodox strikes with complete control, moving from one technique to the next. At one point, McGregor does a goddamn rolling wheel kick into a full body clinch almost seamlessly, which is crazy. McGregor also showcased his wrestling and jiu-jitsu prowess in this fight, taking down Holloway numerous times. Not only did he take him down, but he transitioned easily between Holloway's full guard, to side control, to knee on belly, to full mount and back control, controlling him the entire time with finesse and looking at points like he could secure either a rear naked choke or even a head and arm choke. However, there was far less ostentatious reasons for McGregor showing off his grappling skills. At some point during the fight, McGregor tore his ACL, presumably while either throwing kicks or while absorbing one of Holloway's many leg kicks. Funnily enough, eating leg kicks was at one point one of McGregor's most commendable traits in terms of fighter toughness, which is ironic given what was to come years later. Either way, the fact that Conor was able to fight through such a serious injury, all while putting on a clinic against a fighter of Max's caliber, outclassing him on the feet, in the clinch and on the ground, is a testament to his toughness, durability, composure and fight IQ. Even still, McGregor wasn't happy with his performance, lamenting the fact that he didn't get a finish in yet another classic post-fight press conference moment. Wearing his custom-made suit, he pulled out a solid gold pocket watch, saying that 3 people died making it, and said he needed finishes or he was going to fall into debt fast. Again, this was during an era where ripped jeans and tap-out t-shirts were the norm for fighters to wear at press conferences, but we'll get to how McGregor changed all that a little later. Regardless, this was yet another classic McGregor moment, and he was quickly becoming one of the biggest stars in the entire sport. That may sound like hyperbole, but consider this. Not only would this be the last time McGregor would feature on the prelims, he would never, with the exception being UFC 178 against Poirier, fight again on a UFC card where he wasn't the headliner. From prelim fighter to consistent headliner in 2 fights, just simply unheard of. McGregor would have to take 11 months off to heal from his torn ACL, a more than respectable turnaround for a professional fighter at the highest level. But the wait would be more than worth it. Not only would Conor headline a UFC fight night against Diego Brando, but he would do so in his hometown of Dublin, Ireland. Now, being that I'm from Ireland and I was living in Dublin at the time of this event, I can tell you unequivocally that the hype and excitement surrounding McGregor, this fight night, and the UFC as a whole, absolutely eclipsed any prior MMA event ever held in the country, including the 2 UFC events previously held on the Isle. It was also the first time that Conor headlined a weigh-in, doing his signature double bicep pose and screaming like a lunatic, while the crowd went absolutely ballistic. Conor dispatched of Brando in the first round via TKO. In fairness, Brando put up more of a fight than his previous 2 opponents, showing little fear, pressing Conor and landing some decent shots. Nonetheless, Conor dominated Brando, even landing a beautiful reversal of Brando's attempted bodylock takedown. I'm not going to go into more analysis of this fight, or the rest of his featherweight fights, because I don't want this video to be 3 hours long, but also because I want to do a more thorough analysis a little later on in the broader context of McGregor's popularity. Just 2 months after dispatching of Brando, McGregor was matched up against Dustin Poirier at UFC 178. This was the first instance where you really saw Conor get into the head of an opponent. Poirier truly couldn't stand the pre-fight trash talk, much to the glee of McGregor. In the end, the pressure of the event and the gulf in skill, at least at the time, led to McGregor getting the TKO. I think it's fitting and ironic that given their recent history together, that Poirier would be the first person to truly fall victim to Conor McGregor's trash talk. But of course, more on that later. McGregor's first fight of 2015 was against Dennis Siver, a seasoned UFC fighter who'd already had 11 fights in the promotion over a span of 8 years, and over 20 pro fights in totality. In spite of his experience and his background as a WAKO World Kickboxing Champion, Conor was a nightmare matchup for Dennis. At 5'7" and with a 70-inch reach, Siver was already at a physical disadvantage. But the real issue was stylistically. Siver is the definition of a conventional MMA fighter or conventional MMA striker. Short and stocky, utilising a basic orthodox stance and throwing well-drilled but straightforward striking patterns. McGregor was easily able to evade and punish the German fighter, putting him away in 2 rounds. If I had to pick my favourite McGregor fight, not biggest or most impressive or most iconic, just my favourite, it would have to be his fight against Chad Mendes at UFC 189 for the interim featherweight championship. Originally meant to be headlined by Conor and Jose Aldo, the reigning featherweight champion, Aldo pulled out due to a rib injury only 11 days before the fight. Aldo, an elite, wiry fighter with absolutely nasty striking, including a penchant for vicious, often fight-ending leg kicks, was subsequently replaced by Mendes, a stocky wrestling powerhouse with a 17-2 record, who held wins over the likes of Cub Swanson and Ricardo Lamas, and who had challenged Aldo on 2 occasions for the featherweight strap, even going the distance with the Brazilian in his second effort in a fantastic fight. Conor gets a lot of flack these days for inactivity, but back then Conor was not afraid to take on anyone, and we'll see further evidence of this as we look at later fights. Having to fight a Division 1 wrestler after spending an entire fight camp preparing for an elite striker with less than 2 weeks' notice is a situation that I'm not entirely sure people understand the gravity of. McGregor would have easily been within his rights to turn the fight down in order to protect his momentum and undefeated UFC record, but he accepted the fight and was set to attempt to capture his first piece of UFC gold, albeit interim gold. Again, I'm going to discuss in more detail Conor's fighting style a little later on, but I'd be remiss not to analyse his performance here, at least from a defensive perspective. Mendes scored 3 takedowns across 2 rounds, including a beautiful driving double leg takedown early in round 1. Coming into this fight, there was one question on everybody's mind. How would Conor do against a wrestler? And yes, it's true that Mendes took Conor down 3 times. And yes, he did inflict some significant damage, including opening up a gash on McGregor's eyebrow from some gnarly elbows from Conor's guard. However, Conor got up from 2 of these takedowns, a hip escape in round 1 and a scramble from a submission attempt in round 2, which led to Conor TKOing Mendes only seconds later. The most enduring image from the night for me was not Conor lifting up his first piece of UFC gold. It was Conor smiling and gesturing Mendes to bring it on, blood running down his face at the beginning of round 2, to the rapturous approval of the pro-Conor crowd in Las Vegas, Nevada. 5 months later, McGregor went about unifying the belt when he finally faced off against Jose Aldo on December 12th at UFC 194. Now, unless you know absolutely nothing about the sport, you'll know that McGregor hit a charging Aldo with a perfectly timed left hand to end Aldo's near 10-year unbeaten run, dethroning the only featherweight champion in UFC history in a record-breaking 13 seconds. If you were to divide Conor McGregor's career into 3 thirds, this would be the culmination of the first third. By the way, I'm very aware of how ridiculous that sentence sounded in my accent. But anyway, Conor's rise from highly touted prospect in April of 2013 to undisputed featherweight champion at the end of 2015 was nothing short of spectacular. Over 7 fights, he took out 2 future UFC champions and one of the greatest champions of all time. His pay-per-view fight with Aldo became the second best-selling pay-per-view in UFC history, second only to the colossal and historic UFC 100. McGregor was not only the undisputed featherweight king, he was now the biggest star in the UFC, and it wasn't even close. So how did we get here? When looking at Conor's rise to the pinnacle of the sport, there are 2 key components to this: fighting style and personality. Now, much has been made of Conor's fighting style, with those who lament his more recent heavy-footed boxing heavy style clamouring for what they call Karate Conor. And it's true that Conor did adopt somewhat of a karate-like stance during this part of his career, a stance likely influenced somewhat by fellow SBG training partner and UFC welterweight Gunnar Nelson. However, as far as I'm aware, Conor has never actually formally trained in any style of karate. He has, however, trained in Taekwondo at the Terenure Taekwondo Academy in Dublin. And this to me makes more sense, as most of Conor's spinning kicks are more commonly utilised in Taekwondo than in karate, while his stance, low hand position and darting movements could be attributed to Taekwondo as easily as it is contributed to karate. He also trained a little in capoeira, showcasing some of those techniques in most of his fights up until this point. However, Conor's first martial art was boxing, and if you look at his MMA record, which is filled with knockouts, he only ever knocked one person out with his legs, and it's widely agreed upon that Conor's best weapon is his devastating left hand, a gift he likely discovered and honed while boxing. So then, was he a boxer, a karateka, or a Taekwondo practitioner? The answer is, well, all of the above. What made Conor so effective in these early days as a fighter was his ability to blend these styles, along with some overlooked Muay Thai, with his natural fight IQ, reflexes, and focus on movement. When you watch these fights that we've discussed, most of them begin the same way. Conor opens up with a kick to the body, usually a spinning back kick, and relies heavily on further kicks to the body and eventually to the head. I believe he did this for 4 reasons. 1. Body attacks wind your opponent, which is a great way to drain their stamina and their morale. 2. It catches them off guard and keeps them guessing. Most fighters would start a fight using more conventional striking techniques, like a 1-2 or a 1-2 hook low kick or something to that effect. When you attack first with your most unorthodox and unpredictable techniques, it inflicts damage early on and can cause your opponent to panic. Number 3. Distance management. McGregor was one of the first fighters I can remember watching who used their teep like a jab, digging it into his opponent's midsection as a way of both gauging distance and causing damage. He would also utilise side kicks to the thigh, not unlike a John Jones oblique kick, for the same purpose, while using his other array of roundhouse side and spinning kicks to keep his opponent at bay. After this, while likely frustrated and accumulating damage, his opponents would often rush in and try to attack Conor, which would leave them open to number 4, Conor's counter-striking. During his peak, Conor was the best counter-striker in MMA. His reflexes, instinct, and ability to evade punches while firing back was second to none, and he would punish his opponents with frightening frequency and even more frightening accuracy, all while still working on the bodies of his opponents, eventually incorporating more strikes to the head, both for damage and to make his attacks more varied and unpredictable. Not only did most of these fights begin the same way, but most of them ended the same way, and I don't just mean by knockout. Look at his fights against Seaver, Mendes and Brandao. They all have identical stoppages, which is them cowering against the cage exhausted, eventually getting dropped, taking some ground and pound, and having the referee step in to stop the violence. To me, this is beyond a coincidence, and is definitely not due to lack of fitness. These are men who have gone the distance in many fights, often 5-round wars. To me, the reason all these fights ended the same way is due to Conor's bodywork. You see, as fancy as those kicks are, I don't think Conor ever really threw them to get a highlight reel knockout. I think he threw them to wind his opponents, which in turn would cause them to blitz in and get tagged by a far superior counter puncher and boxer, and, after being physically and mentally depleted, would be wide open to a barrage of Conor's dynamite punches, which would ultimately lead to the fight being stopped within 10 minutes. It's likely that the Brimage and Poirier fights would have ended the same way too, had it not been for the fact that Conor stopped them before the point of exhaustion. I'm not a coach or an expert by any means, and this is just my analysis, but if that was the game plan, it was brilliant and worked every time. Conor had a unique skill set within the striking realm of MMA. He combines his powerful and precise boxing with traditional martial arts footwork and a myriad of techniques borrowed from Taekwondo, Muay Thai and kickboxing, bolstered by his natural aptitude for fighting. Not only did this allow him to go unbeaten all the way to the top of the division relatively unscathed, it allowed him to do so using a fighting style that was dominant, unique, innovative and, most importantly, exciting to watch. Conor was a pioneer in the sport. Sure, there had been masters of unique footwork like Dominic Cruz, devastating counter-punchers and traditional martial artists like Lyoto Machida, and a litany of knockout artists, but no one blended all these attributes as effectively as McGregor. I want to wait until part 2 to fully contextualise McGregor's overall rise to the peak of the sport, but needless to say, unless you were there from the beginning, watching McGregor's run up the featherweight division, it's hard to really explain the pure fervour that surrounded the man. It was easily the most exciting run of fights I've ever had the privilege to witness, and I don't think we'll ever see the likes of it again. And this isn't me speaking as an Irishman, as the McGregor hysteria was becoming a worldwide phenomenon. The second element, of course, is Conor's personality. Now, let me be clear, I've met, known and befriended dozens and dozens of McGregors in my life. Go to Dublin and you're likely to encounter many people who have comparable wit, charm and cockiness. Dubliners are some of the funniest and most affable people on the planet. I mean, they're known worldwide for it, and McGregor is no exception. The many sound bites from this era that we've come to know Conor by would not be groundbreaking or even unusual in any Irish pub in Dublin City. However, because Conor was really the first Dubliner with that strong brogue to showcase this kind of attitude on a global stage, it came across as charming, hilarious and genuinely special. He also had an unwavering confidence. Before a fight, Conor would pick the round, go out, and actually knock his opponent out in the round that he picked, earning himself the nickname Mystic Mac, which only added to his aura. However, none of this would matter, and I mean none of it, if Conor couldn't back it up in the octagon. It was the combination of Conor's ability to captivate the audience both inside and outside of the octagon that made him so special. But again, I want to fully contextualize this in the second third of the video, to really emphasize the magnitude of the man and the impact he had on the sport.